It is an honor to be speaking here at LUMA, and it's been really interesting to hear about the importance of interdependence for art, literature, design, a sense of community. But I'm going to talk about the importance of interdependence for survival, literally for survival. If I were to make an equation, a mathematical equation, it would be interdependence equals survival. My background is in history, and I think it's important to repeat some history. Next year will be the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and it's important to remember that in May of 1945, Europe was in ruins. And anyone who's been to Berlin recently should keep in mind that 80% of the buildings in Berlin were destroyed. In 6 years of war, 60 million people were killed. And after the destruction of Europe came the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. And what was unusual about that was to destroy Dresden, to destroy Berlin, to destroy Tokyo. It took hundreds of airplanes with tens of thousands of bombs to destroy a city. And then with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we learned one airplane, one bomb, and a city is gone. The atomic bomb introduced the greatest efficiency in murder and destruction that the world had ever seen. And so after the war, worldwide, there was a fear and there was an awareness of what happens when racism and nationalism and intolerance are allowed to flourish. So that was the lesson of the Second World War. And in 1946, one of the best-selling books in the United States was a collection of essays about the need for interdependence, the need for international cooperation. And Albert Einstein contributed an essay to that book, and one of the things he said in it was, quote, "The construction of the atom bomb has brought the effect that all the people who live in cities are threatened everywhere, constantly, with sudden destruction." The title of this best-selling book, which really helped to create support for the United Nations in the United States, the title of this book was very simple: One World or None. So the world responded to the incredible murder and the devastation of the Second World War by creating all kinds of international organizations and new treaties that would make catastrophe less likely. Disputes would be resolved peacefully through negotiation and not through a world war. And the result was the longest period of peace and prosperity in the history of Europe. The exceptions being Yugoslavia, more recently the Ukraine, but there have been almost 75 years of a peace that Europe has never known in all of its history. But the horrors of the past seem to have been forgotten. My last book was on nuclear weapons, and I am very sorry to tell you that nuclear weapons never went away. Right now, there are 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and they are ready. Thousands of them can be used within minutes. Many people think that the danger of nuclear war right now is greater than it's been at any time since August of 1945, when nuclear weapons were used for the first time, and the only time. Right now, there are 9 nations that have nuclear weapons, and their relationships are very complicated, much more complicated than the superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the use of a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world would affect everyone in the world. If India and Pakistan, who are neighbors, who dislike one another intensely, who have deep religious and ethnic differences, if they had a nuclear war with just 200 nuclear weapons, which is a tiny fraction of the 15,000 that there are in the world, an estimated 1 billion people would die, and not just in India and Pakistan. Because when it comes to these weapons, and when it comes to radioactive fallout, borders, national borders, are irrelevant. I'll give you an example. In April of 1986, a technician went to work in Sweden at the nuclear power plant where he was employed, and he set off all of the radiation detectors. And they checked the plant, and they couldn't understand why he was radioactive because there had been no leak at the plant. And that's how we realized that 600 miles away from that plant, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had melted down. It took a worker in Sweden setting off a radiation detector, and in the next few weeks, deadly radioactive fallout from that one reactor fell not only on the Ukraine, but on Russia, Belarus, Bulgaria, Romania, Finland, Sweden, Austria, Norway, and Germany. So this poison knows no national boundaries. The other existential threat that we face right now, in addition to nuclear weapons, is climate change. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air right now is larger than it's been in 3 million years. That's longer than humanity has existed. So we are interconnected and we are interdependent, literally, with every breath that we take. And it matters what your neighbor is doing. In San Francisco right now, about 29 to 30% of the most harmful air pollution, the particulates in the air in San Francisco, are coming from coal-burning plants in China. And until recently, I lived along the Central Coast in California, which is Big Sur, Monterey, Carmel, with some of the cleanest air in the United States, and the air pollution that we had was coming from China, 6,000 miles away. Up until a few weeks ago, there was a great installation at the Saatchi Gallery, a virtual reality installation, which said it best. We live in an ocean of air, and every breath we take is connected to the breaths that other people are taking and to what is being pumped into the air. So I mentioned these two big existential threats, nuclear weapons and climate change, and how is the world responding to them right now? Throughout the world, we are seeing a rise of racism, nationalism, religious intolerance from India to Indiana. And throughout Europe, you hear echoes of exactly the same attitudes that led to the Second World War. In the United Kingdom right now, you have a mass delusion called Brexit that is supported by almost half the people in the United Kingdom. And it is, in fact, a delusion. It's this notion that the United Kingdom will rule the world again. And there is nostalgia, there is genuine nostalgia for the British Empire again. It's a delusion because the reality is that the economy of the United Kingdom is smaller than the economy of California. And the notion that an independent United Kingdom is going to be able to make all these incredible deals and be in a stronger position because they're independent, it's wishful thinking. It's totally wishful thinking. In my own country, we have a commander-in-chief who can launch a nuclear war without any consultation with anyone else, who's a simpleton, who doesn't know history, who is like a child. And as a result, we have racism and a celebration of white supremacy in the United States. And my president is tearing up treaties and mocking international cooperation and threatening a war right now with Iran. And you would think that his political party would have learned a lesson from the last war that we started in the Middle East and how that turned out. Meanwhile, in Russia, you have a rise of Russian nationalism that predates the revolution, and Vladimir Putin making threats about nuclear weapons. And one of the things that I think the world has really ignored is what's happened in Syria. Thanks to Russian support, more than 500,000 civilians have died in recent years. And when you look at the pictures of what Syria looks like, huge parts of Syria, the only thing it brings to mind is Europe right after the Second World War. I'm going to quote you from the Declaration of Interdependence that Will Durant wrote in 1944 as World War II was ending, because I think this quote is timeless. Quote, "Intolerance is the door to violence, brutality, and dictatorship." And the one thing that I would have added is war. So Brexit is madness, is a delusion. But that level of madness, to me, is insignificant to the other delusions that we're plagued with, racism and nationalism. We now know that race is completely a socially constructed idea. There is no biological basis for race, now that we've looked at the genome. And the insanity of racism is that we're judging somebody by something that does not actually exist and for which they have absolutely no control whatsoever. The idea that you would judge someone primarily by who their parents are is absurd. The one thing that they had nothing to do with is what so many people in the world are judging other people by. Nations are socially constructed ideas. There's a great sociologist, Benedict Anderson, who called nations imagined communities because they only exist right here. If you went back 100 years ago, most of the nations of the world today did not exist 100 years ago. And if you went back 300, 400 years ago, even fewer existed. This is a modern invention, and it exists in our imagination. So, what is to be done? Well, we have to reimagine these things. We have to change the narrative. We have to embrace the thinking of the 21st century, and it is possible to do. If you look at my own country and the incredible prejudices of my own country, and yet we have marriage equality, and it's occurred in a very, very brief period of time. And before the current president, we had an African-American president who, that would have been inconceivable when I was born. When I was born, black people and white people couldn't use the same bathrooms, couldn't stay in the same hotels, couldn't sit in the same part of a theater. So we are able to reimagine our relationships to one another and reimagine how we treat one another. We have to recognize that interdependence is a necessity for our survival. That means more cooperation it also means more activism against intolerance. Cynicism is a luxury we cannot afford. This notion that all politicians are corrupt, this notion that nothing can be done, and sitting back, it's a luxury. We need a sense of urgency about what is happening right now, because it's very simple. If you don't fight the fascists win. And they are very willing to be active in behalf of what they believe in. Now, it's very complicated figuring out proper ways of interdependence, because there's enormous tension between embracing the world but not being submerged by it. How do you fight against things like the McDonaldization of the world and the mauling and sprawling and homogenization and everything becoming the same? How do you preserve authentic local traditions and yet still embrace interdependence? That's a very difficult question, and I can't give you a simple answer, but I know that what unites us is more important than what divides us, and this is not an academic question, this is an urgent question. So I really congratulate LUMA for making interdependence the heart of this gathering and saying that art must be engaged with society and not apart from society, because the reality is, right now, and I'm not exaggerating, we are facing the same choice as 75 years ago. One world or none. Thank you. Sorry.
That was amazing. Thank you very much. I'm sure you will agree with me.
That's what's happening.
So many questions,
Yeah.
though, and I'm sure everybody here has many questions. But I wanted to start a little bit to discuss the subject of institutions, because at the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about the institutions that were created in the aftermath of the Second World War and the continuous ongoing wars at that moment. What kind of institutions do we need right now, if the world is moving to the kind of like the way that is kind of like outlined? How can institutions respond? And do these institutions are any similar at all or not to the pre-existing institutions that were shaped in 75 years ago or in that period?
Well, you know, again, history. My background is in American history, and when you look at American history, you see all these social problems, and you see institutions created to deal with them that then become co-opted and taken over by the agents they were created to resist. So right now in the United States, we have found that the agency supposed to regulate the airliners were allowing our largest manufacturer, Boeing, to do whatever it wanted. So it's called capture. These institutions are captured. And there's this sense that you work and the problem is solved, and then you just move on. The problem is never solved. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant resistance. So to me, it's not necessarily creating brand new institutions. It's reclaiming these institutions from the very powerful forces that have taken over. I mean, a lot of the anger that is creating the racism in Europe and the nationalism in Europe comes from a feeling of powerlessness. And if you look at the rural areas in the United States, and you look at the rural areas in Europe, they really have, in many ways, been neglected and forgotten. So how do you take the EU, how do you take the United Nations and revive them with a kind of a genuine spirit that cares about democracy and cares about ordinary people, but those institutions are waiting to be used, and if we don't, someone else will. Thank you.
Another question related to that. Again, you spoke about the responsibility of governments, communities, politicians. Moving towards the future, what can be left behind in order to move forward to another set of positions? If, for example, like, you know, you spoke about the genome as well.
Yeah.
Do bodies need to be left behind in a way? Like
Do bodies?
Yes, the way that we recognize them, or not?
No.
Does technology need to kind of like be more involved in the way that the reality is being presented, or not? Like how does, you know, from your own perspective, how does that kind of like relation between these kind of like new formations and the pre-existing formations can happen?
Well, with technology, I love technology. For my own work, it's just so incredible that I can go online and read, you know, documents that I would have had to spend days in a library 20 years ago to find. So I'm not a Luddite. I don't oppose technology, but I feel like we have to be very suspicious and critical. And technology is a tool. And when I lived in California, I lived not far from Silicon Valley, about an hour and a half, and you have a culture there that is worshiping the tool and not what you can create with the tool. So humanity and our bodies are what are to be served by this technology. But what I would get rid of, and what we need to be fighting against, is the militarization of cultures throughout the world and armaments. I mean, the nuclear weapons are the most destructive machines ever made. So we have to bring the number down, down, down until it's as low as possible. But my country is spending more on weapons than I think the next 15 or 20 countries in the world combined. And when you have those weapons, there is an enormous pressure to use them. When we look at Latin America right now, the tragedy in Venezuela is extraordinary, but the countries in Latin America don't necessarily love one another, but none of them have nuclear weapons. None of them are threatening one another with annihilation. And I talked about, you know, I don't like the kind of nationalism in Russia right now, and I disagree with it. But why is my government threatening to slaughter the population of Russia, and why is the government of Russia threatening to slaughter the population of the United States? And France has 300 nuclear weapons. This, if you step back from it for a second, this is madness. So just to limit and reduce the militarization of our cultures is going to reduce the odds that we're going to use these weapons.
And from what you described also, to me it sounds almost like a rhetoric of aggressiveness which overtakes everything.
Yeah.
And that's also part of a wider scheme of things, which also involves economies and the way that a lot of subjects and fields and disciplines are being structured. How can things be restructured, and where would you start if you would restructure something?
You know, in my writing, if you look below everything I write, what I am fighting for in my country is compassion. And for the last 30, 40 years, we have celebrated greed, individuality, and a kind of a culture that sees people as objects to be used. So just compassion, which is connected to a sense of interdependence. I mean, I had a privileged background, but my work has taken me among the poorest people in the United States, and rather than leading me to feel superior, it's made me see, there but for the grace of God go I. There is such a thin line between privilege and the total lack of the means of survival. You have to look at the pictures of Damascus and Aleppo and the lives that were being led there 10 years ago and the total destruction of these lives. But the other thing, to quote my favorite French philosopher, I think is so important when you look at the extremism and you look at the arrogance of these ideologies. We have to follow what Camus wrote. He urged thought that knows its limits. That's a sort of humility about your own beliefs. So you can be a devout Muslim or a devout Christian or a devout Jew and respect one another's religion because you think your own faith is true, but there's enough uncertainty, there's enough humility about it that you would never think of condemning or slaughtering or denying someone with a different ideology. And when Camus was writing that, he was opposing the totalitarianism of communism. But the totalitarianisms that we're facing today are religious, they're nationalistic, but they're also very, very similar to this sort of arrogant ideology that is willing to kill people who disagree or who look different or live differently.
We had a very brief conversation just earlier, and obviously from what you mentioned in your presentation, the sense of community is very important and something that needs to be revived in many ways, something that needs to be injected with more energy. And I believe you've been here in Arles for a couple of days now, and I'm interested to know what is your sense of the existing community here, and also what is the kind of like your approach to kind of like the way that culture can create this kind of like interdependence and interconnectivity in the specific locality, in the specific context.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying this to please the audience because I say what I think, but I love Arles. And I spent a summer in the south of France when I was a teenager, and the Arles of today in so many ways reminds me of the France that I once knew. I love the fact that so many people don't speak English, and you have to try to speak French. I love the fact that there are no chain stores. I did not see a Starbucks, that it has a very distinctive identity still, and that there's a pride in that identity. And as LUMA becomes more and more successful, I think that Arles will benefit, but at the same time, Arles needs to be very careful in preserving its identity and not being subsumed and becoming like cities everywhere. I mean, I've seen so many beautiful parts of my own country, like Aspen, like Santa Fe, even Big Sur, which are changing as people come in there. So again, there's no staying the same, because you look at other cities that decline and lose their population if they don't change. So you need to change, but how do you work out the formula of changing and embracing the world without losing your identity? It's just something that you have to constantly be thinking about and processing.
I mean, one of the big questions for myself and in general, something that we've been discussing is also the decision-making processes. And this kind of like, as things are transforming and changing, how a decision-making process, who shall decide or who does decide? What do you think about that?
I'm old-fashioned. I believe in democracy. And again, coming back to my country, it's the absence of democracy. It's the total control of the political system by money that has led to the anger. And the anger is being expressed in a simplistic way, in a very dangerous way, but it's real. And the inequality in America is the greatest it's been in 120 years, and that leads to unrest. So by having ordinary people have their voice heard and reflected, and that's the only process. I mean, the old quote is, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now I wanted to ask the audience if they have any questions, because I'm sure there's some questions around. There must be a couple of roaming mics. So if you have a question, don't hesitate to lift your hands and someone will come to you. There's a question there. The lady with the white shirt in the middle. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Hello. Speaking about democracy, I know, taking into account what you just said about having its flaws but still being better than the other systems, it seems to me there's always a majority and a minority, and the majority rules. To me, that's a language of opposition, not a language of consensus. So I'm just kind of wondering about that, because it's something I'm contemplating a lot lately.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't think a true democracy would be that whatever the majority believes in the moment is what the rules should be. If you look at how opinion polls change, if you look at how attitudes change, you have to have fundamental decisions made in a democratic way, but you absolutely have to have protections for minorities. You have to have certain basic principles, whether it's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, gender equality. We can go through all of those things that are the foundation of the democracy, but, Hitler was put in power by a vote. So you have to have certain fundamental agreed upon things in the society that a single vote can't overturn. And again, it's not as though you ever arrive at this perfect place. It's a process of being. It's, I got a fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant last year, and I carried the fortune with me in my wallet until I accidentally put my wallet in the washing machine, and the fortune got washed with it. But it really expresses my whole worldview can be expressed in a fortune cookie phrase, which is that the virtue lies in the struggle, not in the prize. So democracy is the process. It's a constant process, and you're never going to get at the ideal solution. But when you stop the struggle, when you stop opposing what's wrong, that's when things start to collapse on themselves.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So what I understood, thank you for your talk.
Where are you?
Is like your solution would be compassion.
Yeah.
Here.
Right.
And compassion in a world, of course, we're not facing only human beings. You were saying the interdependency of all kinds of beings until like the last molecule around here. We understood now we are at the limit of the world, that we are one. So that's one positive thing maybe about the period of the Anthropocene. So I'm interested to say, okay, what is your vision? Compassion, how to do this compassion combined with another kind of democracy, certainly, because we have to start, democracy is not a vote every 4th year. On Sunday there is a vote also around here. What kind of democracy or what kind of compassion? How would you express or put it into action, this compassion?
Well, as people...
You, Eric Schlosser. I'm not talking about the world, I'm talking about you.
Yeah, well, as people who know me well would tell you, I am a deeply flawed human being. So I make no claim to sainthood, and I make no claim to being free of hypocrisy. But it really begins with your own daily behavior. And I've been involved as an activist on so many different issues for the last 25 years, and I've met some very famous ones who are such assholes and are so full of shit, and their public pronouncements are completely contradicted by how they are living day to day. And I'm trying not to be that way. So just how you are in your interactions with people on a daily basis, and what decisions you're making in your own life, and how you are with your family. I mean, I couldn't repeat to you, there's a Confucian proverb that's, if all is right with a family, then all is right with a village, and if all is right with a village, and you get bigger and bigger. But the point that you make, that's a very valid one, is it's not just the interconnectedness of people, which is true, because biologically we are the same, but it's our interaction with the natural world and with species, and fighting against extinctions, and fighting for biodiversity, and protecting the oceans. I mean, there's no end to it. And if you were to think that it was your own responsibility, yours, to solve it all tomorrow afternoon at 3, it could really lead to a total depression and doing nothing at all. But if this sounds so corny, but the first step is to be awake and alert and aware, and the second step is to do something. And if lots of people do something, it's amazing how much change happens. So for me as a writer, if you were to read one of my books, they don't end with the solution to all the problems. But what I'm trying to do is create awareness and provoke thought, and that's, to me, the first step.
One more question. Francesca?
Half answered the question I wanted to ask, but I've always been a little bit suspicious of Armageddon theories. And whilst your talk packs a really great punch and was very, very interesting and put a lot of things into perspective for me, I was sort of coming to the end of it feeling like, what, is there any hope? And that's the problem I have with Armageddon theories. So you mentioned compassion, and most of us probably in the room try and practice it one way or the other. And I just wondered, as an activist, and I'm an activist or an advocate, I would say, I wonder what is the best way now forward to actually change people's perception and their behavior? Because somehow I believe that just awareness isn't enough. We need to have solutions that we can apply to our day-to-day lives. Most people don't know what are the basic steps they can take. And I don't know, how do we actually get out of this situation? Because I think just creating the image of the bad news is somehow not enough anymore.
Well,
how would you approach it?
I'm sorry if what I said led to a lack of hope, because the real message in the immediate sense was fight the fascism. So that's an immediate sense. You know, when you look, I've read a lot about apocalyptic thinking, because apocalyptic thinking, particularly, in the Western tradition, goes back thousands of years. And a lot of apocalyptic thinking is people worried about their own death, and they're projecting into the world their own fear of dying. So everyone's been waiting for the end of the world for thousands of years, and we're still here. I'm personally not apocalyptic. If I were genuinely apocalyptic, I would be in Joie-le-Pin right now, on the beach, swimming, because saying all of this to everyone would have no impact whatsoever. When you look at nuclear weapons, however, it really is the only technology that has made the apocalypse possible. And in the book that I wrote about nuclear weapons, I wrote about there were a few times, really, when we almost had a nuclear war that would have killed hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So there's this, you can be apocalyptic or you can be in denial. And I think that there's a path that looks clearly at what the danger is and doesn't feel paralyzed by it and is willing to act. And so that's what I've tried to do. And I guess, we spoke about the oceans, and what you're doing for the oceans is a form of acting. And there may be someone here who cares about animal welfare and is opposing industrial factory farms, which are institutionalized cruelty. And there's someone else here who believes in LGBTQ+ rights. So there's not one thing. It's sort of, what do you feel passionate about, and what are you going to do? And then how do you find ways to collaborate and cooperate with other people? I mean, I'm involved in all these, I could make a whole list of issues that I give my time to, but it's what you feel passionate about. The most dangerous thing of all, I mean this quite sincerely, the most dangerous thing of all is not nuclear weapons, it's not climate change, it's not the fascist, nationalist, racists, it's apathy. It's a feeling that nothing can be done, because those people who want to change the world a different way are going to do it if we don't act in some way. So I didn't mean to bum everyone out. My goal was to energize. Anyway.
It was not the case at all. I think well, the way you explained it is really bringing this this desire to become active. I just wanted to pick up very, very briefly about what you said on Arles, because of course this is touching deeply, and there's not one day where I don't think about it. Yeah, I would like to say that we are not in a bubble, and to pick up on something else you said, it's the addition of many different things that makes this archipelago we are speaking about, also a lot with Hans Ulrich and around Edouard Glissant, but also the accumulation of all these actions may feel threatening in the beginning. It may feel big or monumental, like I heard also from Francesca or from other people. But I just think that it should be able to be embraced and just come along without it being a threat, because it's actually not a threat. It would be a threat if it is in a bubble and if it is deciding only by itself, which is not the intention. So I truly hope that everybody can keep on speaking French here, but I also hope everybody can learn English.
And I think the presence of everybody here is a perfect representation of of the LUMA not being a bubble, and the openness and the amount of thought that can be produced here. So with this in mind, I would like to thank Eric for one more time for this very insightful presentation. It was really rewarding for everyone. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much.